Hilchos Tumas Meis Perek Shnayim ve'Esrim, the laws of corpse impurity, chapter 22. We're continuing on the topic of tzamid pasil, the idea that if a utensil is wrapped with a tightly sealed covering and it's in the same room as a corpse, the corpse impurity doesn't penetrate to the inside of that vessel. The verse which the Torah uses to describe this law says, V'chol kli fasuach, any open utensil, asher ein tzamid pasil Allah, that doesn't have a tight covering over it, tamehu is impure. From which we learn that if the utensil did have a tight covering over it, then it's pure. But the Torah uses two important terms here. First of all, it calls it a kli. It calls it a utensil, a vessel, a halachically recognized and significant utensil. Plus, it calls the covering, tzamid pasil, a tight covering. Which means that in order for tzamid pasil to work, two conditions have to be met. The utensil that you're using has to be considered a utensil, and the covering that you're using has to be a very tight covering. Which is going to lead to the topics of today's chapter, defining what is a halachically significant utensil in the context of tzamid pasil, and defining what is a good covering in the context of tzamid pasil. I should note that a lot of the concepts we're going to be dealing with today are going to be elaborated at length in the whole section of laws later in this book called Hilchos Kelim, the laws of utensils, where the Rambam will define in great detail the different parameters and guidelines for what constitutes a vessel, a utensil, and what does not. Here, the Rambam is going to give it to us insofar as it's related to the laws of tzamid pasil, but what we're getting here is kind of a short taste or a glimpse into the larger laws that relate to this concept. And at the end of the chapter, we deal with the covering itself, the nature of the covering, what qualifies as a covering and what does not. Halacha Aleph says that Rambam shulei hamechatzim. There is a type of utensil called a machatz. According to most, it's a type of pitcher that had multiple entrances, and at the back of the pitcher, there was what's called shulei hamachatz, the underside of the machatz, the big barrel. It was basically a sort of a handle. You can put your fingers in and hold the utensil, but if you turned it over, technically it was a receptacle. It could hold liquid on its own. So the Rambam wants to know this part itself. Is that considered a utensil? And if you covered that, anything inside it will be saved in a tent with a corpse. Vishulei karkerois hakelim. Some texts have karkeois, others have karkerois. It's the same meaning. The bottoms of utensils that are hollow. Many times, this is an upside down pottery utensil. The top is here, the bottom is here, but many times it was hollow. And technically it could itself be used as a bowl, as a holder. If you turn it upside down, the underside became somewhat of a utensil. V'dafnei sehen me'achreihen. And the walls of utensils from their outside. Sometimes utensils were like this. The walls themselves, if you could rip out this piece and hold it up that way, it would shape a utensil, somewhat of a holder. So all of these things, if they broke off of the larger utensil, so if the machatz, if the shulei hamachatz broke off of the machatz, now all you have is this, or the bottom of the utensil broke off, or the wall of the utensil broke off, and it's enough that it can hold some liquid. Ein matzilin b'tzamid pasil ba'el meis. They're not called a utensil. Even if you cover them tightly, they don't save what's inside them if they're in the tent of a corpse. Unless, kirsamon, if you cut off the sharp edges, v'shafan, and you smoothed them down, you filed it down, v'asan kelim, and you made specifically, now this is a utensil on its own, it's no longer an accessory of what used to be a larger utensil, but it's a beautiful little bowl on its own, matzilin b'tzamid pasil. Now if you'll cover them with a tight covering, they will save what's in them if they're in the tent with a corpse. She'ein matzil b'tzamid pasil ela kelim. The guiding law here is, the verse says kli, it has to be a utensil. So the only thing which could save with a tight covering is if it's a halachically recognized utensil. By the way, the Ma'ari Kurkus, one of the commentators here, says that Rambam is speaking about a case where they broke off to make the point that he makes at the end of the halacha, that if you polished it down, filed it down, it's good. But the truth is, even while they're still attached and the keli is in full form, the bottom of the utensil or the underhandle of the machatz also will not serve as a proper keli for a tzamid pasil. The Rambam here is just making the point that even if they broke off, it's still not till you make it into its own little utensil, and then it's okay. Halacha beis, kli cheres, you have a pottery jug, shenasan beitit ad chetziyai, that you filled halfway with mud. So we're going to read the Rambam, then I'll tell you the interpretation. The Rambam says, loy bitloi, the fact that it's half full with mud does not cancel the purpose of this jug as a jug, and therefore, v'im hishkia bayas hakelim matzil, if you sunk utensils into the mud, this jug will save those utensils from becoming impure through the corpse. Now, the simple understanding of this halacha is that you didn't cover the jug. The fact that there's mud inside the jug and you sunk the pot into the mud, that itself, the mud, so to speak, acts like a tzamid pasul, like a proper covering, and saves it from becoming impure. The Ravid, however, takes great issue with this. He says, if the pottery jug was open from the top, that means that the corpse impurity enters the jug becomes impure. Once a utensil becomes impure, it can never save anything inside it. So who cares that it's half filled with mud? How will that make a difference? The Kesef Mishnah explains no. The jug was indeed covered with a tzamid pasil. The novelty of this law is that the fact that you filled it halfway with mud doesn't take away the halachic status of this jug as a jug. Indeed, Reb Chaim Halevi writes, Reb Chaim on the Rambam, that if you would fill it up fully, then you have canceled its usage as a utensil. And even if you cover it with a tzamid pasil and you have kelim inside of it, it's not going to work. In this case, when it's half filled, you still retain some usage. Then if you covered it with a tzamid pasil, of course you covered it. If you covered it, what's inside here is saved because the status of the jug as a utensil hasn't been canceled. Halacha Gimel, let's address what happens when a utensil gets a hole. At what point does a hole in a utensil render it unfit to be used as a vessel? Kli cheres, a pottery utensil, matzil b'tzamid pasil, saves anything inside of it when it's tightly covered, ad sheyinakev b'moitzi rimain, until it gets a hole the size that a pomegranate could exit. And that's referring to a smaller utensil where you don't really fit many objects. So since to begin with it's small, if it gets a hole the size of a pomegranate, that's it. It's rendered unfit. Uve gadol, if we're talking about a bigger utensil, you use it to store things that are larger than pomegranates, then the pomegranate-sized hole doesn't render it unfit, ad sheyipaches rubai, until most of it becomes destroyed. 51% of the utensil has to become a hole. It's not really a hole at that point, it's a broken utensil. But the point is, till 51% of it becomes ruined, it's still a valid utensil. Now, that doesn't mean that if it has the hole as it is, and you just cover the top of it, things will be saved. We'll see in a second, you have to stuff the hole. But the point is, the hole, the fact that there is a hole, doesn't cancel the utensil's usage till the hole covers a majority of the utensil. Ketzad, what does this mean? Kli gadol shenifchas. Chetzyoy, I know some texts have ruboy, but the commentaries change it to chetzyoy. A large utensil, if even up to 50% of it caved in, and you covered the top with a tight covering, and you also sealed the hole with a tight covering, it still continues to save that which is inside it. Even though with regards to contracting impurity, it's no longer considered a utensil. But for tzamid pasil, till more than half is destroyed, it's good. Avol, however, that's only if you completely stuff the hole. What if you have a hole that wasn't stuffed? Then a much smaller hole will render it unfit. Kli hamukaf tzamid pasil, if you have a utensil that was wrapped with a tight covering, that had a hole or a crack and you didn't seal the hole, it becomes impure. It doesn't save anything inside it, even if it's smaller than a pomegranate size. How small, at what point does a hole disqualify the saving capacity of a utensil? So it depends what the purpose was. If it's a utensil made for food, the hole that would render it unfit is if an olive can fit out of it. If it was made to hold foods, the amount of the hole has to be enough that you can get liquid in through it. To get liquid out of a utensil, a much smaller hole is required. To get liquid into a utensil, a little bigger of a hole is required. That's kainis mashke. So if it gets a hole that liquid can go into it, then if you don't seal that hole, the utensil is rendered unfit, doesn't do the job of tzamid pasil. If a utensil is made for both food and drink, we go stringently. In this case, stringently would mean a smaller hole. The moment it gets a hole that could let in liquid, it no longer saves in a corpse tent until you seal the hole or at least make it smaller than that. The other case would be, let's say, with regards to contracting impurity. We would still consider it a vessel till it gets a hole the size of an olive, if it has a double use. That's what it means l'chumra. You always go stringently. Whatever hole would dictate stringency, that's the hole we follow. In this case, a smaller hole would dictate stringency. In case of contracting impurity, a bigger hole. So we always go in the stringent way. Halacha dalid tanur shahi sasrida al piv. we have an oven that was covered with a srida. We saw yesterday srida means the covering, the plate that was typically used for covering an oven. Umukaf tzamid pasil, it's surrounded with a tight covering. The cover is attached to the oven very tightly. V'nasun ba'ayala meis, and it's inside a tent with a corpse. V'nisdak hatanor, and now there's a crack, which actually is a hole, not a crack going down. It's somewhat of a hole inside of the oven structure itself. Im haya hasedek meloi pi mardeya, if the crack was enough to allow the edge of a mardeya. Mardeya is an ox goad, kind of like a prod to get animals to move. This is typically how it looked. It had on one edge what's called a charchur, on this edge is called a dorvan, and this is the mardeya itself. It had a circumference of a handbreadth, which means it had a diameter of about a third of a handbreadth. So if it will allow in this mardeya to go inside, shehu hekef tefach, which is the circumference of a tefach, nitma hatanur, the whole oven becomes impure. It's no longer serving as a tightly covered vessel. Even if it can't go in to the crack, this mardeya, it's of equal size. You can have two things that are the same exact size. It won't go into another till it's a little bit smaller. The point is, if the size of the hole, even if it's exactly the size of a mardeya, it already ruins the capacity of saving of the oven. If the hole is smaller than that, a mardeya wouldn't be able to fit in. It isn't even the size of the mardeya. Then it's not a big enough hole, and the whole oven is pure. What if the plate, the covering, got a hole? A little bit bigger. If it has a hole in which a mardeya could actually enter, not the size of a mardeya, a little bit bigger that means, because to enter you have to be a little bit bigger than the thing itself. Any less than that, it still gets saved with the tight covering. If the crack was exactly circular, commentaries explain that a mardeya wasn't exactly circular, it was somewhat oval. But what if it was exactly circular? On the one hand, it could actually be smaller than a mardeya's size, but because of the circular capacity, it may not let in the mardeya on its longer edge. So the Rambam says, we don't look at it as if it's elongated. Elongated means oval-like. We don't elongate the circle. We simply follow the mardeya. If it can't go in, then it's saved. If it could go in, then it's not saved. Halacha hey, tanur hamukaf tzamid pasil. You have an oven surrounded by a beautiful tight covering. Okay, this is an open one. Let's imagine there's a covering on top. Shenikav nekev be'enoi shel tanur hatucha, and a hole appeared in the eye of the oven that was already smeared and sealed closed. They used to have what's called a vent hole. That's the ayin. Used to allow smoke out. You could even put some extra twigs in through there. In the case of a tanur mukaf tzamid pasil, obviously you sealed all the openings. You sealed the top. You sealed this hole. The thing is, in the sealage of the hole, a little hole became. Nikav nekev be'enoi shel tanur hatucha. The eye of the oven that was already sealed got a little hole. So that little hole, at what point is it too big to stop saving the oven if it's in the room with a corpse? Im haya hanekev meloi kosh nichnas v'yotze kishehu doilek. It's a very interesting benchmark that we set. If the hole was big enough for a spindle, this is the piece of wood that you use to spin thread around. If a spindle was on fire and you can push it in and out of the hole and it wouldn't suffocate the flames, because if it's exactly the size of the hole, in the moment you put it in, there's no more air and it's going to put out the fire. But if you can put it in and out of the hole and it will stay lit, that's a big enough hole, and the oven becomes impure. But if the hole was smaller than that, you would put the spindle in and out and you would suffocate the flame. Nitzal, then it's not a big enough hole and the oven is still saved. Whatever's inside it remains pure, not affected by the corpse impurity outside of it. Halacha vav. Nikav hatanur mitzidoy. What if the oven itself got a hole? Not a hole in the sealant in the vent hole. A hole in the actual tanur. Here the amount is, as long as a spindle can get through it. In and out, even if it doesn't remain on fire. A hole of another element, a barrel stopper. They used to have a barrel stopper, and it was surrounded by clay. If that got a hole, the amount is, if the second strand of a rye stalk can go in the hole. If you look at rye stalks close up, you have the actual grains. Then you have these little things sticking out of it. The lower they are on the stalk, the longer they are. The top ones are shortest. They get longer and longer as you go down. So measuring from the bottom, not the first stalk, not the first thing sticking out, the second one, the second strand. The second strand, that's the mitzvah shniya. If that can fit in through the hole, it's too big of a hole. Why is it measured by rye stalks? So some of the commentaries say they used to use these rye stalks to actually test the quality of the wine. You would put it in and then you can pull it out, and based on how the wine looked on the stalk, it would dictate certain things. That's an interesting concept. If anyone knows anything about that, by the way, online, anything about this ancient wine testing, please let me know. A large barrel, clay barrel, that got a hole, similar concept, if the hole is big enough to allow the second strand of a reed. A regular reed also has different strands coming out of it. Second strand from the bottom, if it goes inside, it's too big of a hole. Smaller than that, they're pure. Says the Rambam, when do we go with these amounts? If these barrels were made for wine. If they're made for any other liquid, even the smallest hole of any size makes them impure. The covering no longer helps for them until the hole is sealed. Why is there a difference between wine and other liquids? Commentators deal with it at length. Not getting into it here, there's multiple suggestions. Again, if you know something from online, please post it in the comments. Even when the barrels were made to hold wine, these levels of holes for the second strand of the reed or the rye was only said if the hole was made not by a human intervention. But if a human made the hole, even the smallest size, even if made for wine, it's also impure. And no saving if they're in the same room as a corpse until you seal that hole. We have a barrel. It's a picture I found online, so I wanted to use it, even though it's not a big barrel, it's just a small cup, but it brings out the point. You have a big clay barrel, okay? Imagine this is a barrel. Malaya mashkin tohirin, it's full of pure liquid. As the commentaries say, the liquid only goes till about halfway, okay? It's not fully full. It's only somewhat full with liquid. Umeinikis or umeinekes shel cheres besoicha, with a clay straw that's used for siphoning inside it. We all know what siphoning is, right? You have liquid in one cup, you take a straw, you bend it out, you suck on the straw, all the liquid will come out to the other one. So they used to do this also for emptying wine from one barrel to the other, or other liquids. So you have a barrel, and there's a special meinekes, a special straw that was actually put in through the side of the barrel, and it was used for siphoning. And the hachavis mukefes tzamid pasil. In this case, the barrel is also covered with a tight covering, unesuna ba'el meis, and sitting in a tent with a corpse. So the question is, does the fact that the straw is open to the air, does it let in the impurity into the barrel? So first of all, the commentaries point out that obviously the hole in the barrel at which the straw enters has to also be sealed with a tzamid pasil. That's A, that's for sure. Now what's the law if all the criteria are met? The barrel and the liquid remain pure. V'hameinekes tmeya. But the straw itself becomes impure, because one end is inside the barrel, which is blocked by a covering. But the other end is open to a tent with a corpse. It's not sealed. Even though typically these siphon straws were crooked. Crooked is not sealed. So since it's not sealed, it lets the impurity into itself and it becomes impure. So the Ravid asks the two obvious questions. First of all, a straw is seemingly open on both ends. That means it isn't a receptacle. One of the basic laws for keli is that it has to be a receptacle. How did the straw become impure if it's not a receptacle? So the Kesef Mishnah answers that it's crooked. The siphon straw is crooked, maybe upwards or downwards, whatever, in a way that at one point in the straw it could hold liquid. There is a point where it's a receptacle. The bigger and more pressing question is, if the straw is considered open enough to allow impurity into it, why doesn't it allow impurity into the barrel? To this, the Kesef Mishnah answers that in that regard, the fact that it's crooked makes it sealed. In many cases, we have an idea of a crooked alleyway when it comes to the laws of Shabbat. Sometimes a crooked alleyway is considered to be a separate domain. So a crooked straw, or a tilted straw, at an angle, is considered to be sealed insofar as letting the tumah into the barrel. Letting the tumah into itself is not considered sealed. Halacha ches, chavis hamukefes tzamid pasil, shenikva mitzida, you have a barrel. sealed with a tight covering. It got a hole in the side. And the sediment that had collected in the barrel from the wine sealed the hole. Hitzil, that's fine. That's a good seal. If the human being sealed half the hole with other materials, and the sediment sealed the other half of the hole, now it's a doubt. Because maybe by you sealing part of it, you're demonstrating that you don't care about the sediment. So can the sediment's power join your power? It's a doubt. If you sealed the hole with a branch, you must seal also the point of the hole where the branch enters, you have to seal around that as well. If you sealed it with two branches, you have to seal around it and also in between it. There should be no room for holes for the Tumah to escape, or for the opening, to be considered an opening for the Tumah to enter. Same thing if you have a board on an oven and you sealed it all around on the sides. Hitzil, you've saved the oven. If there's two boards, same thing. You have to seal it on the sides, and you have to also, this is a barrel, not an oven, but the same idea. You seal it on the sides, and also in between the boards, you have to put in sealant. What if you connected the two boards with wooden nails? And we don't mean nails from the outside. Today, many times you assemble a bookshelf, you see this. They have holes already prearranged in the sides of boards. You put in a wooden peg, and there's another hole on the other side, and you attach the pegs. So it's being held together on the inside by these two wooden pegs. That's what the Rambam means. You attach them with wooden pegs, or you wrapped it with cork. You pressed cork down on the space between the two boards. There's no need to seal it in the middle anymore. It's called sealed, only from the underside where it connects to the oven. And now the Rambam Taka says, what materials can we use to create this surrounding cover that's considered a tight seal on a utensil? Bisid, some texts have the order a little bit mixed up, but we're going to go with the order that's in my Rambam and the Moznayim Rambam. Bisid is lime, ubecharsis is clay, ubegipsin is gypsum, bezefes with tar, ubeshaiva with wax, betit with mud, uvitsoya with other types of filth. Tsoya usually means dung or manure. Here it means just other sources of dirt. Uvechemar with mortar. Uvechol davar hamismareach, or anything which could flatten as you seal it. The commentaries say it includes also sap from certain trees. The ein makifin, but we do not use as a cover loy beba'atz, or avots, some say, tin, v'loy ba'eferesh, nor lead, mipnei shehu pasil ve'eineit samit, because while it's tight, it doesn't attach the cover to the utensil. Umakifin bidvela shmeina. We can also make a covering out of a fig cake. It was very common to press figs together and make a covering out of it. As long as the figs never came into contact with liquid, so they haven't become susceptible to impurity. We can also seal a utensil closed with dough made out of juices, no water there. If there's water, then it can become impure. Then impure things will not be a blocker. So if it's a dough made out of only fruit juices, that's a fine thing to use as a sealant. Halacha test, megufa sechavi shenischalchala. You have a barrel stopper that became loose. It's still kind of tight in the hole, but it's a little bit loose. Afal pisha eina nishmetas, even though it's not falling out, eina matzelas, it no longer saves. Share nisrayeya hatzamid, because the tight covering became weak. Hakador v'habekas shel gmi. Kador means a ball, but the commentaries say it's referring to a kind of a ball that had holes in it. Bekas shel gmi is also like a ball of reed yarn. Bunch of reeds, turn it into a ball. And you put it onto a barrel. And you sealed it on the sides, where the opening of the barrel is. Loy tatzil, it doesn't save. You must also cover the entirety of the ball, or the entirety of the ball of reeds, because there's holes. And the tumah will still enter through those holes into the barrel. So the whole thing must be sealed from all around. Same thing, if you have a cloth, and obviously we're talking about a cloth which is smaller than 3 by 3 finger breadths, so it doesn't contract impurity. Small cloth, shekashra al piakli, and you tied it over a utensil, as they used to do. They used to cover utensils with paper, with cloth. Same thing, you have to seal the entire covering, because in the cloth there's small little holes in the weave. But if it's paper or leather, ukshara b'meshicha, and you put it over a utensil and you tied it with a string all around, im meirach min hatzdadin hitzil. If you then just seal it on the sides, no need to seal the entire thing, that's already enough. Halacha yut. Chemes shel oira dog oy haniyar. You have a flask, a big flask made out of fish skin or paper. Shehilbish bohen nesachavis. And you dressed a barrel with them. This is like a paper covering. Here you have a massive flask. You're literally covering a pitcher with a flask. Okay? The question is, can that serve as a good covering for a tzamid pasil? So the Rambam says yes, utsrara milamata, as long as you tied it down from the bottom, you have to seal it and also tie it down, like in the case of paper and leather. Harezu matzelas, that saves in a tent with a corpse. V'im lo yitzrara, but if you didn't tie it down, afal pisha meirach min hatzdadin, even if you sealed it at the sides, lo tatzil, it won't save. Because we don't treat it as a regular cover, we treat it as a paper cover, which requires both elements, sealing and also tying down. That's somewhat of a question that the commentaries raise. We mentioned yesterday that tzamid pasil, Torah says, tzamid pasil alav. The utensil has to be under the covering. Here, if you put a paper flask over the pitcher, the covering, the sealing part is going to be down here. Nevertheless, the commentaries say that's probably still considered over, as long as it's over the covering, as long as it's over the utensil, not that the utensil's, turned upside down and it's on the floor like we had in yesterday's case, that's fine. Halacha Yud Aleph, Chavis Zefusa. You have a pitcher or a barrel which was lined inside with pitch, as was common, because the clay was very porous, it would allow things to absorb. If you line it with pitch or with a resin, then it would stay more protected. Interestingly, what happened over here is, the clay came off. The whole barrel is made out of clay. The lining is just a little lining. The clay came off, but the lining of the pitch is in place, it's wonderful. So now you basically have, this is a little bit of an inaccurate picture. This happened all around. So you have a barrel coming up, and then the top part is just a line of pitch, essentially. But you put the covering of the utensil onto the pitch. You pressed it down till it's stuck very well to the pitch. What happens is, you have this section of pitch in between the covering and the actual floor of the barrel. It's still fine. The pitch now assumes the status of the utensil. Same thing if you have utensils that are used to store fish brine. And things like them that leave this residue on the side that literally accumulates and it could actually become thick like a wall. And it ended up happening that part of the outer part of the utensil came off, and what's left is just that accumulated residue like a crown. You have the barrel and the accumulated fish brine on the side, and you covered it. As long as it's all pressed together and stuck together, it saves, it's a good covering, and it would classify as a tzamid pasil, and if this utensil was in a room with a corpse, the corpse impurity would not spread to anything in this utensil.